We have a guest that spoke here yesterday, Neil Wood, who gave a riveting talk about how the lack of legalization is affecting us globally in ways that we couldn't imagine. Neil is a former UK undercover officer who is now an international activist for drug law reform. Today, he's going to give a talk on legal control and the path to community security. So Neil, hi again, welcome.
Hello again, everybody. I'm sorry you've got to put up with me again.
I just need to tell you that you really have to stand behind those two.
Okay.
Also, you have more light if you're back here, so we can all see you. Thank you.
No feedback, okay.
Yeah.
I've listened to a few interesting comments from Icelanders and various people, including a taxi driver, when I've explained what I was going to talk about here. And there's some interesting comments that, one comment was that we've made a mistake. We shouldn't have let those foreigners in. We shouldn't have let those construction workers come from another country, because that's what's opened up all the different drugs coming into the country. And I found that really interesting because it's a very old trope with the war on drugs, is to talk about those other people, now it's their fault. So I just thought I'd mention that and weave into what I'm going to say today a little bit. But just to explain what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about general drug policy. Now you probably sit here thinking, why is he going to start talking about heroin and crack cocaine again when this is a hemp and a medical cannabis conference? But I hope that by the end of talking today, I will give you a little bit more, a few more tools in the box to discuss this with other people. Because the importance of legal control of cannabis, both for medical and more importantly for general adult use, the importance of it goes beyond people who just used cannabis. It goes way beyond it. It is a significant factor in our urban security and our community security. Because organised crime is becoming more connected. Organised crime is so connected that in most places, by one financial route or another, there are the same people in charge of one commodity as is in charge of another commodity. You have organised crime groups from China, for example, being a very dominant force in the UK in growing cannabis. And interestingly, in recent years, the UK is actually a net exporter of cannabis. In fact, it's the biggest net exporter of medical cannabis. And we were the biggest exporter of medical cannabis before we had legal medical cannabis. How do you work that one out? And in fact, at one time, the Prime Minister's husband, Theresa May's husband, was a big financial backer of British Sugar, which was the grower of this medical cannabis, which we were exporting to Canada. And yet we were still sending people to prison for medical cannabis at the same time. So corruption goes in all sorts of different directions. But I'm not going to talk about political corruption today. I'm talking about the growing power of organised crime. So bear with me, I will get there and explain the link with the financial markets and the overlapping markets of drugs. But first I'm going to go back in time a little bit and explain how one of the events that got me into this. So when I started working undercover, I had no idea how to work undercover because they didn't train me. Because the type of work that I did was a fairly new type of undercover work where I had to go into a city centre, essentially find the right people, make friends with people, network with people, and persuade them to introduce me to gangsters. So that was my job. I didn't have any introductions or anything. I just had to find my way in that city. But in order to do that, I had to blend in. And in order to do that, hang on, you know what I forgot to do is set my stopwatch. What would you say? I've been talking for about 4 minutes, do you think? Let's see. Set my stopwatch going. That's better. So I would have to blend in. And in order to do that, I was observing the people around me and seeing how they behaved. I mean, to start with, I used to sort of present myself as being a bit of a travelling thief. So I would dress in my one-piece tracksuit and my Nike Air Max trainers like the other thieves. And that got me so far, that opened up some doors for me. But I realised that actually the people with the most connections are the people who were most vulnerable, the people who were really struggling with life. They were living in squats or they were homeless. And so those are the people I manipulated. And in fact, it developed so that whenever I went to a new area, a new city, I would look for the most vulnerable person to manipulate. And if that sounds ruthless, well, of course it's ruthless. Of course it is. That was the nature of what I did. It was ruthless. I was using vulnerable people for my own end, or rather the government's end. So I ditched the tracksuit and started really dressing down. I dressed incredibly scruffily. I would get dirty and smelly. In fact, I developed a technique when I was doing an operation in Nottingham, same operation I mentioned yesterday, trying to get close to the Bestwood cartel. And I dressed so dirtily that at the end of the day, I would put my clothes tightly in a plastic bag, especially if they were a bit damp, and I'd put them somewhere warm overnight. So the next day, they really smelled, like really bad. And I remember being dropped off to the plot, which was the area in which I was working, by the drug squad the next morning, who was providing my backup in that operation. And they were winding the windows down and sticking their heads out the window saying, "You dirty bastard." They were really quite mean to me. But I sort of could see the point. I was a mess. Anyway, they dropped me off. And that day, I was going to meet a heroin dealer who I'd been buying heroin from for quite a few weeks in increasing amounts. And that day, strangely, he was being driven around in a taxi, but he still wanted me to walk to meet him about a mile away. So I was walking along what was then the red light area of Nottingham. It was a very long, sweeping road and quite a well-to-do area, really. And it was about 1:30 in the afternoon. As I'm walking along, I hear this voice that said, "Sex for sale?" And I thought, well, I know this is Nottingham, but for 1:30 in the afternoon, that's still quite forward. And I carried on walking again, and I heard again, "Sex for sale?" And as I'm walking along the road, a long curving road, I still couldn't see her. "Sex for sale?" And as the road straightened up and I'm walking towards her, I saw her. And then as I'm approaching, she's sort of looking me up and down. And as I get closer to her, she looked me up and down like that. And she said, "Cheap? Sex for sale?" So I suppose you could say that my costume worked, But anyway, I walked past her. I went to meet the dealer. I bought some heroin from him. I did an evidence drop to the team, and then I went out and I bought some crack cocaine of someone else. At the end of the day, you sit around with the team and you debrief and you explain what's gone on. You talk about the evidence and the shape of the investigation. And I told the team this about the woman offering me cheap sex, and they all laughed, like many of you laughed. And then when I went on to train other cops with that story, they've always laughed, and every audience laughs. But if I think back to that day, I have got no idea what that heroin dealer looks like. No idea at all. He's just one more face in an endless face of drug dealers. Probably thousands, literally thousands. But I can close my eyes and I can see her face perfectly. Absolutely clearly. She wasn't a day over 21, by my estimate. She was tall and slim, and she was clutching a can of special brew, which is sort of super strength lager, 8% lager. And she was drinking that lager, desperately trying to fend off the heroin withdrawal that had taken her to the streets of Nottingham to offer me cheap sex. And I was the representative of the government, and she clearly needed help, and I walked right past her to go and do something with huge amounts of resources poured into, which is to try and get evidence against the drug dealer. But there's always another drug dealer. So the point of that story is that it doesn't have to be that way. Those resources can be better spent. And in the British system, in the UK, before it was killed off by American international policy, that woman would have been given a safe supply of heroin, and she would never have had to go to the streets to try and find the money for that supply. She would have been prescribed clean heroin, which is legal regulation. Now, I almost gave up undercover work. Well, I did give up undercover work for a few weeks after that operation. It was emotionally very taxing. But I was tempted back into it by the detective sergeant who was organising the operations regionally. And he said, Woodsy, we need you to do one more job. We need you to do this job because the gangsters for this job are even worse than the last lot. And he was talking about an infamous gang called the Burger Bar Boys. Now, I travel around the world and I say that name and people tell me it's a very British name for a gang, the Burger Bar Boys. They don't sound very scary, do they? But at the time that I did that operation, they were quite infamous because some of them had just been sent to jail for the double murder of two young women called Letitia Shakespeare and Charmaine Harris with machine guns in Birmingham. And one of the gang that I was meant to get evidence against was implicated in 7 murders, and he was the one who provided the machine guns. So they were a really dangerous gang. So I agreed to do it. And so I went to the city of Northampton and I started my normal process, finding vulnerable people to manipulate. I spent a lot of time mingling with people using drugs problematically. I spent a lot of time shoplifting, actually, which is great fun. It is. It's great fun. If you know you're going to get away with it, you know that you're not going to get to prison or anything. It's really good fun, especially if you take turns being lookout and that kind of thing. So I spent weeks and weeks building up this reputation, and then eventually I managed to get someone to introduce me directly to the Burger Bar Boys, so the management of the area. And I'll never forget that introduction because the guy who was introducing me took me into this snooker club. We went into the gents' toilets, and the guy who was introducing me was literally bouncing. He was literally bouncing up and down. He was shaking with fear that much. And I thought, that wasn't exactly reassuring to me. And the door burst open, and this hooded figure came in, went into the cubicle, stood on the toilet, shut the door, and looked over down at me like this and said, "What's this?" And the moment he said that, the door burst open again, and these 4 hooded figures came round and started walking round me slowly. And as he's interrogating me and interrogating my mate, then every so often one of them would punch me or headbutt me on the side of the head or dig me in the ribs or push me into the other one. So this went on for a long time, probably not as long as it felt, but it went on for a long time, and I was convinced I wasn't going to get out of there in one piece. And then suddenly he said, "All right then, what do you want?" And I very politely said, "Can I have 1 and 1, please?" Meaning I'll have a 0.4 of heroin, 0.4 of crack. And I gave him my £40, and that was the start of a relationship between us where we exchanged numbers, and I spent the next few months gathering evidence of conspiracy against the whole gang. After 7 months of that operation, and being quite convinced I was going to die on multiple occasions, at one point they stripped me at gunpoint. And yeah, many times I thought I was going to die. But at the end of the 7 months, I was in the secret location where the job was run from, and I looked at the whiteboards, which was, if you've ever seen like a police drama where you see these boards and there's lines between it and photographs and lists and stuff, it's exactly like that, exactly like that. But it was just absolutely plastered. The amount of information was incredible. I'd gathered evidence against 96 people. So the 6 main Burger Bar Boys, but also 90 other people who were involved in the operation. So the sex workers, people doing the wraps, people heat sealing the wraps, where the stashes of money went, the phones, all this kind of stuff. So I thought, wow, I was just stood looking at these boards, all these photographs, and thinking, wow, this is just going to sweep the city clean. This is going to be incredible. There's no one left. So there were cops brought in from all of the surrounding police forces, hundreds of police involved in the arrest phase. And I spoke to the intelligence officer who was tasked with keeping his ear to the ground as to the impact of this operation. a couple of weeks later, and he said, yep, we managed to interrupt the drug supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. 7 months of work, the piling of extra PTSD onto my already existing PTSD, all of those cops, all of those resources for the sake of interrupting those drugs for 2 hours. You know, I've been having doubts for various reasons. You know, the young woman who was offering me cheap sex was one of the first strong signals to me that things weren't quite ethically right with what I was doing. But this was a real strong indication that things weren't really right with the assumed efficacy of what I was doing as well. That's just not in the script, is it? It's not in the script on TV. When the TV show shows you the dealers being locked up, or whether you see the newscaster showing the doors being smashed in where the cameras go in with the police, and all of these police activities and the way that it's presented to us, they don't go to that part in the script, do they, as to what actually happened? Did it actually stop anyone getting their favourite drug today? Really? Did anyone say, oh my God, I can't find a dealer? Oh no, what's happened? Have the police been busy? That just doesn't happen, does it? So we need the whole script being told. This is important, and it's important for all of the movement, whether your interest is cannabis, whether your interest is general drug policy. We've got to get the script right. We need to be honest and aware of the truth of the situation. But the thing is, it's not just that it had no impact. That's not actually the full story. The fact is that wherever the police create a gap in the market, that gap is filled, and it filled quickly. And the problem is that every organised crime member, everybody involved in that trade, constantly learns from the mistakes of those that went before. Constantly. So you have this constant refining of organised crime, constant development in responsive police tactics. And when you create a gap in the market, very often that gap is fought over. So the net impact in any community of police activity is an increase in violence. Because the trade can be lucrative, right? And the person who gets in there first, the person who gets in there dominantly, can take control and make a lot of money. So you get a flashpoint of violence. And that's not in the script either, is it? Do the police ever say, well, we arrested this gang, and the net impact was there were several stabbings, and we expect this violence between these gangs to go on for the next 3 months? They don't tell you that, but it is nonetheless true. However, it's not always violence, because sometimes the disputes or that gap in the market is fought over by a reduction in price. So you get gangs trying to undercut each other, or they'll do deals. For heroin, it's usually you get 5 bags for the price of 4. That's your normal sort of discount in the heroin market. For amphetamines, it's usually 2-for-1 deals. And that's an attempt to capture the customer base, because you've got the cheapest gear, right? But of course, what that means, I mean, if anyone's like me, you'll have proper laws about this in Iceland, but in the UK, supermarkets do 2-for-1 deals for beer, crates of beer in Christmas time. That's terrible alcohol regulation. But as a person who's struggled with drinking, I go into a supermarket, I'm thinking, 2-for-1? I mean, I wasn't going to drink any beer, but now maybe I want to. Because look how cheap it is. And that's how it is with other drug markets when it's not regulated properly. And so another net result of police officers raiding or arresting a gang where you get people coming in and competing in that market is you get consumption going up because the price has dropped. That's not in the script either, is it? Oh, yes, the net effect of our raid today was that people have got cheaper drugs and are taking much more of them. It's not in the script, but it is nonetheless true. But another thing that this does with organised crime is it refines the activities of organised crime, and because it creates monopolies, people tend to expand their share of the market. I went into this a bit in some detail yesterday, when I was talking about the power to corrupt. If you've got a greater share of the market, you've got more disposable income, you will invest it in corruption. But you will also seek out more markets because there are other lucrative markets. And so the most successful gangs, particularly in urban areas, they might gain their power and their financial strength through trading in heroin, but they're thinking, hang on, we can make money here, but look at those Chinese, they're making a fortune with the cannabis. Let's have a piece of that. And so there's a constant expansion. Now, there was a time, at some point, maybe 2 decades ago, I sort of lose track, there was a time when you could go to a cannabis dealer in the UK or various other countries, and you know that that person would only trade in cannabis. And in some areas, maybe that's still true. But now there is an overlap because there is pressure from organised crime to have more market and more premises and places where their product is sold. So there's an overlap. And nowadays, in the UK, in cities, you are going to be buying off the same person who is also trading in cocaine or many other products. The markets are overlapping. But it's prohibition that has done this. It's prohibition which brings more and more dangerous characters into whatever trade is happening. The most money for organised crime, or the most lucrative markets, are the problematic heroin and crack cocaine markets. And the reason for that is that a very small number of people consume most of the market value of that drug. So if you can capture a relatively small customer base, you can make a huge amount of money off very small numbers. So that's the reason it's so lucrative. However, the next most lucrative market is the cannabis market. And that's because of the size of the customer base. It's the most used drug after alcohol. So there's a lot of money to be made in it, and organised crime are making inroads into it. And this is where it overlaps, as one of the ways that it overlaps, especially with the market of people who need cannabis for medical reasons. Because what's happened in the last few years in the UK, now I should clarify that just a few years ago, we got legal medical cannabis in the UK. It theoretically went legal. But the last information I had, there had been 4 National Health Service prescriptions for cannabis. 4. Yeah, 4. So all that's happened is the private business has grown. You can get private prescriptions for cannabis, which, that means only the wealthy can afford it. It's not particularly helpful. I mean, it's a start, but I look forward to the day when anybody can get a medical cannabis prescription on the NHS, on our National Health Service. But before it was legal, and still now, because of the problem with the wealth gap, people grow for themselves. They grow their own. And there is lots of expertise available. There's much more information. There's good seeds. People know what to do for themselves to look after their own health. But the trouble is, organised crime, always seeking to diversify and making more money, see those people as prey. Organised crime will follow people from supply shops for growing. They will follow them home to find out where they live. There was even an investigation in Manchester where there was a whole wing of an organised crime group which was specialising in identifying people's home grows. And they were planting recording devices on their cars and their homes, breaking into their homes or placing high-tech recording devices to listen to when someone's grow was about to be ready, so that they could break it and steal it. Now, this is incredibly organised, and I say a wing of an organised crime group. That's exactly what I mean. A large organised crime group in Manchester put a team together of specialists just for stealing people's cannabis in general, but it often means medical cannabis growers. Prohibition has done this. Prohibition for all of the drugs has put those people at risk, because it is prohibition of all the drugs which creates the wealth, it creates the expertise, and it allows the reinvestment of one crime into another one. There's even an aspect of this theft which involves identifying people who grow for medical purposes. And instead of burgling them and smashing their doors in and stealing the product, they'll knock on the door and they'll say, "We know what you're doing. We know that you're going to be ready to harvest in 2 months. We know how many plants you've got. We know where you bought your equipment. And we know people who can get you arrested. But if you give us 40% of your product, we'll leave you alone." Some places it's 60%, more commonly 40%. So it's a tax. Now, the only reason vulnerable people can be exploited by organised crime like that is because of prohibition. Because the person growing cannabis is not going to feel particularly confident in reporting that to the police, are they? Because they've been pushed outside the boundaries of normal community, of normal society. They no longer have the protection of the police because they have been made criminal. They have been othered. Now, in the context of what's going on here in Iceland, I've heard people grumble and more drugs are coming in and it's those foreigners and all that kind of thing. You can't shut yourself off from the world, even somewhere with a smaller population as Iceland. You know, the world is growing, the world is changing. People are using more drugs. The drug markets are increasing. We've got this thing called the internet, you know, where people know what's going on and where you can order drugs. It's not the foreigners that's the problem. It's just the inevitable growth of human existence and the fact that people like to use drugs. But you can defend against the influence and power of organised crime, and I would suggest that it's urgent to do so, because change is going to continue to come. And if people have noted the influence of foreign organised crime creeping into Iceland, well, that's just the beginning. But if you can get legal control of your medical cannabis market, and if you can get legal control of your adult use cannabis market, that is a defence against that growth and influence of transnational organised crime. It's a defence, because it's one market where they can't get a foothold. It's one market where they can't use that market to influence the ability to sell other products. It's a defence. Now, does anyone think change is not coming? Does anybody think it's not inevitable that you are going to get more cocaine, you are going to get more of the other drugs? It's the same happening everywhere. The price of cocaine has plummeted, absolutely plummeted. The supply of cocaine's up 35% in 12 months. There's... What, sorry? Also here, of course, also here. I did an event in Umeå in Sweden last year, and the Swedes like to think that they haven't got any drugs. It's incredible. It's amazing. And, you know, I was there in May, and it was quite confusing to me because the night time never seemed to come. I suppose you have the same thing here. It was very confusing to me. But what I did note is, with the lack of the night time, I saw a huge amount of cocaine use. Huge amount. Which, you know, I've got no problem with. If people want to use cocaine, you know, it's their mind and their body. It's up to them. But it amused me a little bit with just how gung-ho and how deluded many Swedish politicians and police are as to the extent of the problem. So it's happening everywhere. But you can slow down the negative impacts of the growing influence of organised crime if your government takes control of the most lucrative market. Because the most lucrative market here will always be the cannabis market. Always. Because you're not going to have such large numbers of people who are self-medicating with heroin. You're not, because it's just the way the numbers work in terms of the percentage of the population to make it lucrative. So cannabis is always going to be the most lucrative market. If you can take control of that, it's a protection. It's the way of making your communities more secure, more safe. It's a way of making policing easier. It's a way of redirecting policing towards other things. And if police want to direct their resources towards the importation of cocaine and heroin, well then if that's the choice that has to be made, I don't necessarily agree with it. But they're more able to do that if the government has taken control of cannabis. And so that was really the message I wanted to try and give you today, so that if you do find yourself in those conversations with policymakers or police, point out that these things are interconnected, and there is a wave of change coming. These drug markets are growing, and this is a way of getting ahead of the problem. It's a way of being ready, and it's a way of protecting yourself against the collapse of security. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure we have a few questions from the audience, and we're going to give time for that. Yeah.
Hello, góðan dag. Hello, nice to see you. I wonder, you're ex-policeman. Have you been able to talk to Icelandic policemen about your theories and thoughts?
Well, it's a short visit, and I haven't had the chance to here, although I have been corresponding with one Icelandic police officer, and please forgive me, I've forgotten his name. But I've been corresponding with him for a few years, and he does agree. I can't remember his name, but I have corresponded with him.
Doesn't matter. But you were in association, isn't that right?
Yeah, I'm part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which is an international organisation.
Is Iceland part of that, or any policemen from Iceland?
No, we have no official members here, but. I speak in more countries where we don't have members than we do. So we have members in Spain, France, Norway, Netherlands, USA, Canada, a few other countries.
But one question more, sorry. Do you guys have something that we could maybe give to police and ministers and people that are making the silly rules?
Yeah, we have
some homepage or something I can find.
We have resources on the Leap USA website, and people can read my books as well. Police quite often find those useful. Okay. In fact, I can leave. I've got 2 more copies of my book. I gave copies of books to the people I wanted to give them to, but if anyone knows one of the local police and want to present those books to them, they can have them.
Okay, thank you.
I think there was a question from Jamie as well. That's a question I usually get from journalists in an audience. But yeah, so the question, if you can't hear, is did I ever have to do drugs when I was working undercover? Well, not very often, thankfully. I never had to do heroin. I'm very pleased about that. That would have worried me. Although one guy was very suspicious of me, and he said, "You're having my blowback," meaning he was going to inhale his heroin off the foil, and then he was going to blow it into me, and I was going to inhale it. He says, "You're having my blowback. I don't trust you." So I says, "Yeah, okay then. Yeah, no problem." And I was there watching him chase it down the foil, and he went like that and blew. And in Bill Clinton style, I just didn't inhale. And I thought, I hope he doesn't see this cloud of like smoke. And if you ever, I don't know if you ever smelt the smoke of heroin. It smells like rotting fish. It's like a cross between smoky bacon and strong oily fish. It's not pleasant. So I thought, can I hold my nose? I can't hold my nose. Oh, it doesn't look good. But anyway, he fell for it. There was another time I was sat in a car actually, and I was the driver of the car, and the guy who was introduced me to the dealer was sat in the back, and the guy who introduced me was sat in the front, the dealer was sat in the back, did the exchange, and I knew that they were being suspicious of me. So I cooked up, I got my spoon. I put about a quarter of the wrap into the spoon. I'm sat there quite calmly, looking around, making sure no one saw me. Cooked up, dropped the filter in, put the syringe in, sucked it up, and then tapped it. Waited because it was too hot. Waited for it to get to the right temperature, cool down a bit. Then I dropped my trousers, and of course, being gentlemen, they looked away. And I put the syringe between my legs and injected it into the car seat, which they thought I was going into my groin because I told them I was going to the same spot. So that worked. So no, thankfully I didn't actually have to inject it, you see. Although I have had to have other drugs, cannabis a few times, but hey. and then once there was this pub where I was going infiltrating, and it was the strangest place because it was a meeting point of gangsters from Nottingham, Leicester and Derby. Weird. You wouldn't have believed it, how many criminals they would fit into one place. But the main guy I was trying to gather evidence against, I made the most horrendous mistake in this operation because I made myself out to be a connoisseur of amphetamines. And I'm not, funnily enough. But this guy came to me and said, "Hey, you." And he held up this little bag and he said, "I bet you've never had anything like this." And I thought, how you don't know. And this bag, it was this sort of lump of toxic looking pink goo. And it was strong base amphetamine. You can almost see it dissolving the bag as he's held it in front of me. Anyway, I must have had a flash of reticence across my face because I saw a flash of suspicion go across his face. And I thought, I'm in trouble here. He's just suddenly got suspicious of me. So I'm going to have it. So I dipped my finger into this bag and it smelt like the urine from a glue-sniffing cat is all I can describe. It was so strong, and I put it in my mouth, and you could feel the mouth ulcers forming immediately. Swallowed it, and he looked at me and said, "You're going to need more than that with your tolerance." And I thought, oh God. So I went in again, had another lot, and within 20 minutes I was feeling pretty extremely high, to be honest, and I made my excuses, and I got out of there. And I was a complete mess. It was most amphetamine at the time in the UK was 5% pure. This was 40%, and I'd had a lot. Now I know enough about the drug. I wasn't going to overdose. It takes a lot to hurt yourself with amphetamine, but it wasn't comfortable. It was quite horrible. And I remember I had to be driven home. I couldn't drive, and I remember thinking all the way home, I've got 8 cans of beer in the fridge at home. I've got 8 cans of beer. That's going to take the edge off it. And I remember finishing the 8th can, thinking, I don't feel any different at all. I'm no different. I didn't sleep properly for 3 nights from that. 3 nights, that's how strong it was. Mind you, my house has never been so tidy.
We have one more question here.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you can tell us anything about different legislation in Portugal about drugs. Are there any different legislations there? Did they do something?
Different legislation protocols.
In Portugal, did they legalize? Yeah.
Is that what you're referring to in terms of the way the drugs are treated?
Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, I mean, oh God, yeah. I mean, I live and breathe drug policy every day from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed. So yeah, I know all about it. But how best to answer it? I mean, in the UK, we've lost our way since the end of the British system. You know, we used to prescribe heroin to people who needed it or cocaine to people who needed it, and we went with almost the most punitive country in Europe. Sweden is way ahead of us, but we're down there somewhere as second. We have the highest prison population in Europe per capita because of our drug policy. It's appalling. So people who use drugs which are considered Class A, and heroin and crack cocaine are considered Class A, that they are treated as criminals. Now, increasingly, harm reduction is coming back a little bit, but it's a tragic situation because in Switzerland, in 1994, they started the British system. They used British evidence to inform their policy. They started prescribing heroin to people who needed heroin. Then the Netherlands followed them. And so as a result, those countries don't have a heroin problem anymore. They are not going to suffer from the opioid crisis which is coming because the government took control, like Britain used to take control. So we went the wrong way, and yet we have this example in Europe of Switzerland and the Netherlands where they're actually treating people with care and respect and actually looking after their health rather than treating them as criminals. So there are shining examples of where we can go, genuinely. And there are good people working on this. But it's up to all of us within the movement. But whatever part of the movement you're in, and I'm grateful to be invited into this space, really, because it's just important for us all to realise that whatever our drug of choice, whatever drug we champion, or whatever we're involved in, we are part of a bigger movement. And we have to be considering the vulnerable people right across the board. And the more we consider ourselves as one movement, the more power we have.